Hi, good evening. My name is Amy McDonald. I'm the director of City Space. In March 2019, we opened this space to 185 events in a year. It was a whirlwind. And then, like so many other organizations, we had to close. This is our second event in 18 months. So, welcome to this small in-person audience and to our much larger virtual audience. All of our events are hybrid going forward, so as restrictions lift, I hope that our in-person audience grows, but I'm glad that we have a virtual audience that can feel safe watching in the safety of their own home. This event was inspired by the New York Historical Society. What the covers, I'm slipping my cover story, Katharine Graham, CEO. I keep on switching it. And Jean Gutierrez, the curator, is going to begin with a 10-minute conversation with Robin. We have wonderful images and artifacts. And then we'll be joined by Linda Henry, Mitra Kalita, two powerful women in their own right, for a conversation about strides women have made. But first, we're going to see a small welcome from Gloria Steinem, who couldn't be here tonight, but whose very good friend was Kay Graham.
To the New York Historical Society for introducing more people to Kay Graham. As leader of the Washington Post, the newspaper that brought down a corrupt president, she was certainly the most powerful woman in the nation, yet she was so shy that she hated speaking in public. As one clue to her bravery, she took Woodward and Bernstein's research. Those were the two great reporters who did expose the president. She took their research and interviews home with her every night, so those files could not be seized or stolen. She should be credited also with New York Magazine and with Ms. Magazine, neither of which could have started without her help, yet she took no credit for either one. Truman Capote gave her the great black and white ball at the Plaza Hotel. If you don't know this party of the century, Google it. I'm sure you can find it. And she attended as a guest, but she refused to give a speech even there. As owner of the Washington Post, she didn't believe she should tell her editorial board what to do. But when they didn't support the Equal Rights Amendment, as she did, she asked me to get on a last-minute shuttle plane to Washington and persuade them. Actually, I didn't persuade them all, but I persuaded a majority. So the Post did support the Equal Rights Amendment. She was both one of the greatest women of all time and one of the best-kept secrets. I so wish that she was with us today so that she could see the progress women have made in the media, and she would no longer be so alone.
I'm Robin Young, and I am so happy to see so many of you. I mean, we know it's been hard for people to make decisions about coming out, so we just really, really appreciate that you do. And we're also welcoming people who are watching us virtually and people who are outside on the street. Something we have to recognize. Hello there. One or two might even be relatives of mine. They work at the Boston Globe, and we're going to touch on some of the concerns that they have briefly. But tonight is a night about Katharine Graham. And we are going to begin our conversation. I was, saying how nice it is to see so many of you. We are also being masked when we're in small spaces, but I think so that you can hear us, and particularly with Jean and I, we can see because our glasses keep fogging up. We are going to be taking our masks off as we speak up here, but please know that in order to work in this workspace at WBUR, we have to be completely vaccinated. We've all been vaccinated, tested. We test several times a week, so I think you're in a safe space if we do remove our masks. Is that okay with everybody? We're going to do that. Oh, thank God. Oh, my God. Oh, and by the way, and I've been asked, Peabody Essex Museum, they are rocking the masks, so, okay, just there. Jean Gardner Gutierrez, what a job you have. Jean is a curatorial scholar in women's history, and she's going to give us some context to start, because it's just amazing the way that this exhibit all started. It came from a knowledge that while some of us can memorize everything that Katharine Graham ever said or did, there are people, and we have some students here. Are you the students? We have some younger people who may not be as familiar, and so we want to make sure, along with seeing some of this beautiful exhibit, we learn a little bit more about Katharine Graham. For instance, a lot of people don't know, there's sort of a storyline that Katharine Graham took over from her husband, Philip Graham, after he died, took over his newspaper. Well, it was Katharine Graham's family's newspaper. Her husband married into the family business, and many people don't know that she was a budding journalist at one time. So when this exhibit was born, the two women behind it, Louise Muir, who's president and chief executive of the Historical Society, and Joyce Cowan, the philanthropist. The gallery that this exhibit is in at the Women's History Center of the Historical Society is named after Joyce Cowan, and with good reason. Again, she helped support it financially, but also she was having lunch with Louise when she said, you know, we should do Katharine Graham, because people don't know who she is. And Louise Muir was incredulous, so they asked their female server, who had no idea who Katharine Graham was, and they said, that's it. We have to rectify this injustice. Start with her family. Her mother was a freelance writer, and I think we have a slide coming up, Agnes Meyer. Her father, a wealthy banker. He bought the Washington Post in 1933. She did study journalism.
She did, and she also worked as a professional journalist. She was one of the first women to work at one of the New York papers. And through that connection, she became very involved with the artistic avant-garde of not only New York, but Europe. And later in her life, she also became somewhat of an expert on ancient Chinese art. And she was also a philanthropist. She was an activist, very outspoken politically. But that didn't leave her a whole lot of time to be a mother to Katharine Graham or her four siblings. So Katharine Graham wrote in her memoir that motherhood was not exactly her mother's first priority.
But she did get the journalism bug. And I think we can go to our first picture that Jean's brought. Mm-hmm. You'll see a shot of her with her dad, and perhaps in college as well. Okay, well, this is the name of the exhibit. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to there we go. Okay.
So yes.
This is the palatial home. This is a picture of her at school. Shy, but active.
Yes. Profoundly shy, profoundly insecure, really sort of unformed at that time. She didn't have a lot of a good sense of what she should do with herself going forward. So she was raised as a privileged young woman of her time would be, to grow up, be an ornament to society, to marry well, to have beautiful children, to engage in genteel good works. But she also was expected to live up to her mother's sort of impossibly high standards. And her father, until she got bit by the journalism bug, was not really a big presence in her life. It was journalism that really brought them together.
Well, he got her a job.
He did, yes.
And this was not at the Washington Post, but then he did get her a job at the Washington Post. Have I got this right? And famously said, well, if it doesn't work, we'll get rid of her.
Yes.
His own daughter.
So a nice vote of support there, yeah. Eugene Meyer. But yes, she did start at the Washington Post as a copy boy and a messenger in the women's pages. But after she went to college...
They were called the women's pages.
They were called the women's pages. And all of the newspapers had them for quite some time. But after she had gone to college, she started at Vassar for 2 years. She transferred to the University of Chicago, and I believe the next slide reflects that.
Okay, next slide, please.
Oh.
It doesn't, but that's okay.
It does not. But this is 1933 is when her father bought the Washington Post. She was only about 17 years old. And he bought it out of bankruptcy. The Post was one of the lesser papers of the 5 Washington dailies. And he bought it as part of his commitment to public service. Eugene Meyer was a multimillionaire many times over, but he also advised 7 presidents, starting as one of the $1-a-year men in World War I. And so he was deeply devoted to public service, and he bought the newspaper not to make money, because he didn't need to make money off the newspaper, but to inform the public. And so he came up with these principles, which we can see really did inform Katharine Graham's later career, and which to this day are etched in bronze in the Post's newsroom.
Yeah, I think we could see the next slide now.
Yeah. So here she is, yep, as a
Look
young
at
woman, in her debutante gown, I believe. And this is the letter that her father wrote when she transferred from Vassar to the University of Chicago, saying that Kay hopes to fit herself for journalism. So after her graduation, she went out to San Francisco and started covering labor unrest along the docks. She was a very passionate advocate of the labor movement at that time. Yeah. But unfortunately, funding problems at that newspaper sent her back to Washington, which is where she started working in the editorial page of the Washington Post, and where her father made that very supportive comment.
Don't get rid of her. All right, next slide, please.
So yes, only a few months after starting back at the Washington Post, Katharine Graham met a brilliant but rather volatile young lawyer named Philip Graham. Philip Graham was not a journalist. He didn't show a lot of interest in journalism. When he met Katharine Graham, he was about to start clerkship with the Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. They had sort of a whirlwind courtship. He proposed marriage after only 6 months. And when they did marry, he started off their marriage by insisting that he wouldn't touch the horrible hunk of money that his in-laws had. He insisted that they would get along on his, sort of not very great salary. And she was fine with that. She went along with it. But by 1948, control of the Washington Post had passed from the Meyers, Eugene and Agnes, to the Grahams, Phil and Katharine. And he had roughly 3 times the number of shares that she had, courtesy of her parents. And so it was really a gift from them to him, because, as Eugene Meyer said, and Katharine Graham wrote that she agreed at the time, that no man should be put in the position of working for his wife.
Well, and her father, let's have the next slide. Her father made him the publisher, not her.
Not her.
Even though she had studied journalism.
Yes.
So she became a self-described doormat. She completely dropped her journalism and her aspirations, and a devoted wife. Mm-hmm. There is a sad ending to that story. Okay. He killed himself. She ascends to the job. It's viewed with complete skepticism.
Very much so.
So that brings us to this moment.
Exactly.
The black and white ball. What happened?
Well, at that point, Katharine Graham had been at the helm of the Post for about 3 years. She had already discovered the aspects of the job that were the most fraught for her, not only as a relative newcomer to an executive position, but as a woman. So, for example, firing people and hiring people remained highly gendered and very difficult for her throughout her career, because she was always portrayed as this very difficult, tyrannical, whimsical woman, and whoever lost their job was the victim of her feminine whims. So she had already dealt with that. She had already dealt with the election of 1964, where Lyndon Johnson gave her extraordinary access to his campaign, hoping that her personal support would translate into an official endorsement from the Post. But she wrote that she'd inherited a policy of non-endorsement, and she didn't have quite the gumption to do any independent thinking yet. But come 1966, Truman Capote, who's riding this wild whirlwind of celebrity and bestsellerdom with the publication of In Cold Blood, is looking basically for an excuse to give a fantastic party and keep his name in the news. Well, he's already friends with all of these very glamorous, wealthy, international best dressed list women. But if he chooses one of them, the others will all be mad at him. So he calls up Katharine Graham and he says, "Honey, I've just decided you're depressed and need cheering up, so I'm going to give you a party." And she's on the end of the phone saying, "What are you talking about?" But he goes ahead and does it anyway.
It was the party of the century.
It was the party of the century, as Gloria Steinem said, as she wrote about in Vogue, because what it really translated to was an opportunity for Katharine Graham to emerge onto the national stage. She was very well known in Washington. She was very well known among journalists and diplomats and politicians, but this brought her into contact with Hollywood, with the fashion people, with the literati, with the New York intellectuals, with society, with European aristocrats, all of whom Truman Capote drew together and put her in the center of it. So this is not just an opportunity for her to grow her Rolodex. This is an opportunity for her to emerge onto the national stage, because this party was hyped for months beforehand. You know, from the summer to the end of November, people were writing in a feverish way about this party, speculating, oh, who's going to get the invitations? But then she also is able to take that principle behind the black and white ball and make it her own. And so her parties afterwards became very legendary for bringing together all these very different but very interesting people. You know, Warren Buffett wrote about how much he enjoyed her parties. George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, talked about how much that impacted her influence in Washington, because she became a convener of people who had interesting things to say.
Well, and it seemed to help her find the backbone that she always had,
yes.
It would seem, to have all that support. I mean, Warren Buffett would say, after the episode, the era we're about to talk about, that she saved the country. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But what I'm going to do now is synopsize a little bit again, because we're hearing from people who just say they hear Pentagon Papers, and even though for many of us that's seared, they don't know. And part of this story took place right here in our area. So as she's on her way to becoming the most powerful woman in America, surrounded by all these supportive friends and finding the spark in her that was the journalist that was always there, the Pentagon Papers happened. Now, these were these research papers that told the big lie of the time, revealed that the administration knew, the military knew, that the war in Vietnam was unwinnable, and were actually carrying out actions in Vietnam that were unnecessary, and carrying out others that we didn't even know about, that were secret. So this is what the Pentagon Papers were, and they were taken by a researcher, Daniel Ellsberg, who brought them to the house I now live in Cambridge. He came to a bed and breakfast. It was then a bed and breakfast. He held the Pentagon Papers press conference on Hilliard Street, right behind the ART, and the whole block rallied to help him, because the reason that he went public is that he feared that the Nixon administration at this point would do something to him to get the papers back. And so he was public about it on my porch. And neighbors like the late Dunn Gifford, the brother of Chad Gifford, Bank of America. Dunn Gifford had been the Kennedy lawyer, the Kennedy family lawyer. So he called up his friend Neil Sheehan from the New York Times and said, come to Cambridge, we're going to find a Xerox. And they found Xerox machines at different people's companies, and they spent all night Xeroxing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of the Pentagon Papers. Neil Sheehan bought 2 tickets to head back, one for him and then a seat for his knapsack that held the Pentagon Papers. And he went back to the New York Times, not the Washington Post, but the New York Times, and they published the first papers. The Nixon administration tried to stop them with an injunction. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled that they didn't have a right to hold back the printing of the papers. Now the Washington Post, under Kay Graham, decides, and she makes this decision with her editor, Bed Bradley. She signs off on this. We're going to print more of the papers. And not only that, she had 2 reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, who had discovered that the Nixon administration, are you following this? That the Nixon administration had actually done a burglary at the Watergate, a bungled burglary, in an attempt to break into Daniel Ellsberg's therapist's office to try to discredit Daniel Ellsberg. Okay? So she oversees that whole investigation and green lights that reporting as well. So, as others have said, she, made that decision, possibly saved the free press, saved the country from making more mistakes in Vietnam, revealed a corrupt administration, unseated a president. By the way, she printed she authorized the printing of the Watergate research based on an unnamed source, Deep Throat. But she had that much confidence in what was being said.
Mm-hmm. And there was a profound financial risk as well, because in 1971, that was the year that the Post was going public. So they were preparing for their first public stock offering. So if she had, or if anyone at the Post had been hit with a criminal charge for publishing in defiance of the injunction, well, that throws a giant monkey wrench into your public stock offering. And even beyond that, the Post at this point was growing beyond a small family paper into a larger media corporation with radio stations, with television stations, with Newsweek magazine, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you can't have a license you can't hold a radio license or a television license if you have a felony conviction. So in both the Pentagon Papers and in Watergate, the risk was that those very lucrative properties would be stripped from the Washington Post. And that was a threat that the Nixon administration dangled when then Attorney General John Ashcroft made his infamous threat that Katie Graham's going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer.
Yes, he said that.
He really did.
Next slide, please. We'll just leave that sitting there. Next slide, please.
So this is just a quick gallery installation shot to show, we really did want to show that Kay Graham was placed in the middle of all of these different webs. We were very fortunate to have such wonderful partners who they sent their conservators into their galleries and into their collections despite the COVID to get us some really wonderful costumes from the
and next slide, please. We're going to jump through these because I want to get to our guests. So, you know, you do that. You show all those dresses, even though this is also what you show. This is the most powerful woman in America after those decisions. Why? I mean, did you ever hesitate, you know, dresses when she also took down a president?
Exactly. Well, part of what we do at the Center for Women's History is we try to tell an unexpected story. And part of the story with women's power is a lot of the avenues that women use to access power are discounted because they're not necessarily the same ones that men use to access power. And so we have done a lot with, you know, the power of sociability, you know, the power of bringing people together, the power of hospitality. You know, the power of fashion, you know, the message that you send with your clothes. You know, after the black and white ball, Katharine Graham became fairly irregular in the fashion press. And so that kind of thing, you know, that's not the kind of power that you think of when you think of a newspaper owner, of someone who's really got their fingers on the pulse of what's going on in American politics and business and journalism. But that doesn't mean it's not real. And so we do try to highlight these kinds of power that are sort of unexpected.
It is powerful.
Yes.
Yeah. Next slide.
And like, to be honest, you also have to get people in the door. So you're like, come for the pretty dresses and stay for the picture of Katharine Graham as a CEO.
And they are.
So
here's another, I just love this picture of a young Ben Bradley and a much younger Kathleen Graham.
Yes.
But now we come over here. Ben Bradley, of course, the famous editor at the time. There was a pressman's strike at the paper in 1976. And another moment for her where she had to make a decision. What did she do?
So this was...
And by the way,
yes,
that's her in effigy.
It is. That's her in effigy being paraded through the streets of Washington on her way to the Washington Post to be burned. So the pressman's strike was sort of the culmination of a number of years of labor issues at the Washington Post. It went back as far as 1972. And there are memos that we've got in the exhibition. You know, there's one from Ben Bradley where the indignation and frustration is just pouring off the page because he's having issues with the typesetters union, one of about 9 so-called craft unions at the Post, as opposed to the writers and editors union. So those were the people who were responsible for the paper handling and typesetting and photo printing and rolling the papers off the press, you know, physically creating the paper. And they had been putting deliberate typos into the paper, like this paper is edited by rats. And so Ben Bradley is just ripping his hair out and telling Katharine Graham, you can't hold me responsible for putting out a quality paper when I can't control what the people on the 4th floor are doing. And so right about then, Katharine Graham starts sending non-union employees out to be trained in running the presses in the event of a strike. And so in October of 1975, all of the craft unions' contracts expire. There are no contracts in place to replace those, and so the pressmen walk out. And on their way out, they do quite a bit of damage to the presses. There are fires in the press room, and they beat up the press foreman. And the strike that ensued was incredibly bitter on both sides. There was at one point a placard carried by one of the picketers saying, Phil shot the wrong Graham, in reference to her husband's suicide.
He killed himself.
Yeah. And so, Katharine Graham is working at what she considers her family paper. Like, this is very personal to her. And so by December, she offered the striking pressmen a final deal. They rejected it. And she went and made permanent hires. She replaced them, essentially. She replaced a virtually all-male, all-white workforce with African-American pressmen. About 10% of the new pressmen were in fact women, Vietnamese Americans, recent refugees, people who had not been able to access those jobs before. Now, prior to the strike, the Washington Post pressmen had been among the best paid in the city. Were they still after the strike? I don't actually know, but I would assume not. And essentially, it was just a very difficult situation for everyone on all sides. And she did always view it as her greatest failing, was her failure to prevent or in some way finagle the strike so that it didn't happen the way it happened. But she also lost a great deal of her early sympathy for the labor movement. She said in an interview in 1991 that she was no longer really there with the labor movement.
What a synopsis. And by the way, labor issues at a family-owned newspaper, there's no one here who can relate to that. We will, as we said, take this up in passing. But Jean Gutierrez, what a lovely job you did of taking us through an extraordinary life we could have done far more. The exhibit, we need you to know, at the Historical Society in New York is only open till October 3rd. So if you want to, you should get there. And we just thank you so much, Jean, for helping us get some context this evening.
Thank you.
And by the way, as we said, if you have questions, you can go ahead and take your seat. You did great. If you have questions, we've already had some come in from the audience. You can go to slido.com and type in #HereAndNow. So we'd love to have that from you. And now, we're going to bring out two women leaders well equipped to talk about Kay Graham's legacy, having had major roles leading newspapers, although in very different posts. I'm going to start at the far end with Mitra Khalida, managing editor of the LA Times, senior vice president of digital at CNN. Before that, executive editor of Quartz, senior writer at the Wall Street Journal, most recently co-founder and CEO of URL Media. That's a network of Black and brown community news outlets. They share content and revenue. She's also a consultant to companies looking for people of color. We won't talk about that. Co-founder of Epicenter NYC, a newsletter that helps New Yorkers get through the pandemic. Phew, Mitra welcomes, and please welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, she brought a fan club. And Boston's own Linda Henry, Chief Executive Officer of Boston Globe Media Partners, the parent company of the Boston Globe, Boston.com, and Stat News, the first woman to lead that organization in its history. She's also the co-founder and chair of Hub Week, the civic collaboration between the Boston Globe, Harvard, MGH, and MIT. It explores the future being built at the intersection of art, science, and technology. She's also the creator of the Globe Docs Documentary Film Festival. She also hosts, I hope it happens again after the COVID, a regular gathering of all the women, many women in Boston on just the spectrum of careers and professions to come together at her home to hear different female speakers. Linda Henry, welcome to you as well.
Thank you so much.
And I know, much of Katharine Graham's story is resonating with you. We are going to address your current contentious patch with the union at the Globe later, but we are here to talk about Katharine Graham. And let's start with those who might be making a very simple comparison. Took over a family newspaper after her husband died. You took the top position at the paper that you and your husband own. You know, there was a lot of skepticism when this happened. It felt like nepotism. You're frowning. Let me know about the frown. There were people who, thought the wife of. Also, you rock high heels on cobblestones. And as you know, there was some skepticism. Now, I'm going to rush to say that, I know many of the reporters at the Globe. You won them over, especially some of the hard-nosed, toughest, grittiest, most tribal males there. You won their respect. So first of all, how did you feel that skepticism? How did you feel it? And did you do something purposefully to overcome it?
Great question. Thank you. And I just want to say hi. Thank you all for coming. And I want to say a special thank you to WBUR. This is wonderful to be bringing us together. You also have a fantastic and fearless woman leader.
Margaret Lowe, ladies and gentlemen, our new.
And
she came here so excited, and then we had a pandemic.
And BUR is such a treasure for our city. We are so lucky to have this incredible Center for Excellence and Center for Conversation and just incredible journalism right here. So thank you for what you do. I'm so thrilled to be here. And I was here when it first opened, and this is such a cool space. And I cannot wait to be back here when we're able to really fill it up and enjoy. But hello to everybody at home. Regards to your question, I cannot be compared to Katharine Graham, but I hope someday. There's a lot that I've learned from her. I think that, she became, she didn't really come into her own until she was in her 50s, and what she did after her husband passed, and she just kept showing up every day. She just kept showing up. She was sort of in shock and going through the trauma, and she knew that she was committed to it, and she learned by being there. And I have a lot of different business experience that I came from. I've gone to a lot of school. I didn't have the same crisis of confidence, and I also didn't suffer the same crucibles that she did. She had a very abusive husband that really took away her confidence. But like her, I just kept showing up and learning, and took my time to learn the business because it was different from other things that I've been involved with.
And where was the kernel inside you, which she didn't have at first? Again, had been abused, called herself a doormat.
Yeah.
Didn't have something that people feel in you, this spark that you believed you could do this job. Why did you think you could do this job?
It's not that I believed that I could do this job, and it wasn't actually my aspiration to be in this role. My aspiration was that our city, that I care so deeply about, I'm so committed to this region because I grew up in an immigrant family. My father was very, very poor and came here and was just given a chance, and given so many chances. And I am so grateful of the chances that he was given, that I'm committed to making sure that this is a place where more people can have opportunities. And I've worked in a lot of different areas and with a lot of different organizations. And what I realized is that journalism, a good, trusted news organization, is at the core of everything. If you believe strongly in the environment, if you believe in accountability of the police, if you believe in making sure that people show up to vote and participation, all of that, so much of that is tied to a strong, trusted, local, independent news organization. And so I realized that I can't even imagine something more important or more impactful that I can do than to make sure that this city that I care so much about has the strongest possible news organization at its core.
And that's what drove you past the skepticism. But Mitra, I just want to distinguish for people. Linda is keeps herself on the business end. She has top editors like Brian McGorry. You were that editor. So just briefly, what did you do? Like
Before joining Linda as a businesswoman?
Yeah, yes. Who now has this
So,
URL?
I mean, we could be here forever if I tell you everywhere I worked, which you eloquently rattled off. You got a few in there. I've worked everywhere is basically my Twitter bio, but I have worked everywhere. I very much started my career at the most mainstream of the mainstream at the Associated Press. I worked at Newsday. That's where I covered 9/11. I went on to the Washington Post, where I do have, if you'll indulge me, a connection to Kay Graham. Her son, Don Graham, is probably responsible for me being on the stage today. I unexpectedly got pregnant at the Washington Post. I was not married, which if you're Indian and unmarried, it's like a real sin. I did end up marrying the same guy now, who's my husband. So life worked out on that front, but I had a plan for how I was going to ascend in the newsroom, and a baby was supposed to be way years later. When I had my daughter, Don Graham sent me a teddy bear and the longest letter just sort of saying how valued I was in the Washington Post newsroom. You can do this. We can't wait till you come back, but take the time you need. I mean, it was like all the perfect things that men have to do when a woman, whether she plans it or not, goes off to have a baby. And it made the world of difference. I came back to the Washington Post part-time, which was kind of unheard of, right? Like, who gets to a job in journalism, gets to have a baby and like part-time schedules in a newsroom? But they made that work for me, which has everything to do with why I was able to hang on to my career, to hang on to the ascension in the newsroom. I left the Washington Post for a no-name outlet in India called Mint. I set up a newspaper. The Post was very supportive. They gave me a leave of absence to do that. I set up the paper in India. I learned how to be an editor. I learned how to be a manager. I also learned that if you free yourself from legacy media and you start a publication in the 21st century, there's this thing called the internet that we could really have a lot of fun with. And so my path in digital media began. I returned to the Wall Street Journal, went to Quartz, so kind of the places that you've mentioned. And that was really the last 10 years of my career have been spent not just on the editorial side, but how do we look around the corners, embrace a digital future, not lose our past, but also what is the role of newsrooms in creating viable, profitable newsrooms? Because it was, I think, Kay Graham who famously said, you can't be a good newspaper without being a profitable newspaper. There's something, and she was just very savvy about that.
Yeah, a couple of quick things. Wow, what a great experience you had at the Washington Post. My first contract, which I signed in the 70s, it was a program called Evening Magazine and Westinghouse Broadcasting. I signed a contract that said I would not get pregnant or otherwise deformed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, things have changed. However, I just wonder, there was skepticism when Linda stepped up. Did you, and you also a woman of color, the Reuters keeps track of how many women are at the very top jobs in media around the world. Japan, for instance, 0. South Africa has the most. America is second, but I think it's 47 now. That's 47, just 47. Yeah. And that's the top jobs. That's not. Did you feel gender bias when, at any of these stops?
So I think one of the, when we call things microaggressions, I think we minimize the effect of them. So now that there's a word for it, you kind of look back on your career differently. Because you realize the things people would say were actually forms of discrimination. And in the moment, you're just trying to get through it, right? And so, I don't want to dodge the question. Yes, the answer is yes. And yet, it's kind of like the advice I give women and people of color. At CNN, I had this infamous couch where everyone would come and be like, how do we get through the day? I mean, I was there during the Trump years, so I feel like my memoir from CNN could be called These 4 Years, because it was these 4 years were crazy. But for me, it would always say, look, yes, we operate in racist environments. We operate in sexist environments. This is a racist country. This is a sexist country. There's only 47 women who've ascended to the top jobs, but we have yet to elect a woman president. There is an there are systemic problems around us that contribute to this, and yet from there we must move forward. And so it became, I hope I became the person whose couch you would sit on if we were trying to move forward, right? Because my whole career has been not accepting the limitation, but actually, and this is where I think digital and diversity have everything to do with each other, to look around the corner and to say, our audiences of the future and our profits of the future, our advertisers of the future, our business models of the future rest entirely on us moving forward from this existence.
Well, there's a flip side to bias against women, and that is sort of a stereotypical thinking that, well, the research shows that, there's so many different reasons why diversity on so many different levels is good. It brings diversity of opinion, and the research shows that women in leadership positions, can listen more, can see things differently. I mean, than men might probably. I mean, maybe, hopefully, wouldn't have had a contract that said deformed, about pregnancy. But that can also be a problem as well. If there's, this is the part I love when the trolley goes by. We can wave at the people in the trolley. There can be a problem with people having an expectation that a woman might behave in a certain way. And this is where I just want to address briefly, again, because it's not the topic of the evening, but what's going on right now, kind of outside with some Globe staffers and this contentious union negotiations that you're going through right now, Linda, because they have sent us emails, they are holding signs, they are objecting to you being considered a woman in a leadership position.
I assure you I'm a woman.
You are a woman, yes. But,
I don't object to that.
A transformative woman, because they feel that, many of the women that are in the union fighting for, pay and benefits that you are not listening to them. I'm just, mouthing some of the things that we have heard. They say that the Globe is considering outsourcing jobs, is considering maybe selling the paper without a union or without obligations to a union. So just staying with our arena tonight, do you think there can sometimes be a perception that a woman has to behave in a certain way, like, for instance, what Kay Graham went through, has to have more sympathy towards labor issues, for instance, because she is a woman, and that sometimes when a woman gets tough, as is happening in a tough situation, that's not the expectation. Do you see what I'm...
I hear what you're trying to say.
Thank you.
So it's, what's difficult about that question is that you sort of laid forward a bunch of one side of an argument. Mm-hmm. And what I would say is that we have a commitment similar to it's actually identical to the Meyer family initial commitment, that this is, the Boston Globe has been around. Next year we're celebrating our 150th year. And it has been around for a really long time. And our commitment is not just to today, but to the long-term sustainability of this organization. And it is hard. And what we've taken, I was fortunate to join the Globe 8 years ago. And we joined a regional newspaper that was in serious trouble. It was underwater. It was hemorrhaging cash. It was just having a lot of everywhere you look, there were a lot of issues. And we have showed up every day with this steadfast commitment to the long-term sustainability of this really, really critical institution, so it can keep doing what it's doing for years to come. And so we've been investing very, very heavily in our journalism. We have over 330 journalists in our organization, and the largest by far in New England, and we're hiring and we're growing and we're investing further. As we've done well, we're strong, we're sustainable. It was very, very hard. We have invested in every corner of that institution, which is what journalism takes today, which is what regional journalism requires, a very strong, stable, consistent investment all around to get it to a stable place where it can thrive.
Well, we see some of the signs out there. I'm only going to ask you about one piece of this.
Okay.
Because I'd like to offer
I would
you,
like to say that this isn't the place to litigate any union issues, that I am here to discuss Catherine.
I know. We've had long conversations about this. However, if we are giving you the opportunity to make news tonight, if you'd like
I'm
to.
not interested in making news. I am interested in discussing Katharine Graham, though.
Okay, but they have a fear, they say, the fact that you are not, they say that you are not going to commit to, if you sell the paper.
I think that you're not fully informed on the contract. That issue has been negotiated, and we are negotiating that very well. And I think that what I have done for the past 8 years, what my husband and I have done, shows an incredible level of commitment to this organization.
So you're not selling the paper?
I have said many times I'm not selling the paper.
Okay, let us move on.
Thank you.
Why do you think, let's go back to that, why do you think there aren't more women in the positions that you hold, even though, you know, this is an editorial position, and there are a lot of female editors, many at the Globe. Why do you think it is? Where's the bottleneck? You know, if there are more female journalists than ever before?
So I think the bottleneck is men. It's just, so you alluded earlier that we at URL Media, we consult with mainstream media companies. Like, I actually see the mainstream media as partners in what we're trying to do in terms of offering a new way of doing news. And over the last year and a half, partly fueled by the pandemic and how much it's exposed just what the pandemic has done to women at all levels of the economic strata, but also the protests of George Floyd, and companies really having to look at themselves in their own newsrooms, their hiring patterns. We've heard a refrain over and over from some of the companies who we do business with that has been, please find us a woman of color, as though they can kill two birds with one stone. And what I don't hear, which I think is the bottleneck, is I will step aside to make room for a new generation of thinking, of leadership, of business model, of people who would like their turn, right? And I don't hear, I will step aside. I hear, I would like a woman of color as my number two to solve for decades, if not centuries, of the mess that got us here. And I did say, from here we move forward, right? You could throw my words back at me too. You don't have to put her on the hot seat alone. I'll join you. And you could say, well, but you're not solving anything, right? And so I hope what you also hear is, we do have to contend with what has been created, and I don't think the people in charge are actually contending with their own role in it. And they are trying to be additive as opposed to fundamentally transformative. So I would say that one of the challenges is that the power structures of the last year and a half, when this has really come much more to a head. Of course, diversity in the newsroom, both for race and gender, has been an issue as long as I've been a journalist, and I think as long as all of us have been alive, quite frankly. But I think that is, just one theme I'm seeing over and over that feels like, well, we're not going to get out of this as long as that's the attitude.
Well, when I had my first jobs, I was considered a quota baby because it was just that it was a woman. And my best friend was a woman of color, and then another good friend of ours. All three of us were hired at WBZ Radio. He had a disability, Johnny Miller, who's the great Red Sox reporter. So it was Johnny, Beverly, and me, because that's how much of a deficit there was for white women. And when I'm thinking 47 women leaders, I'm wondering how many are women of color.
I don't know the number, but, well, actually, to this point, you were seeing more women of color ascending over the last year as a direct outcome of what I'm talking about. But what pressure on those women, right? And I was just in Houston this summer, and I met with the first Black editor of the Houston Chronicle, Maria Reeve, who's amazing, and the Dallas Morning News has African-American editor. I mean, we're definitely seeing ascension. But we're also seeing ascension at a time when the stakes are very high, and yet in some ways turning around the fortunes of a local newspaper, and Linda can talk more to this than I can, of a paper that's been tethered to a chain and has suffered from, again, like decades of neglect. I mean, that's a tough job. You are setting that woman up.
Well, Linda, the other thing I'm not hearing from the people that Mitra is consulting with is, go get me a woman of color, not, oh, I'm bringing women of color up through the ranks. I'm bringing all women up through the ranks, or people who have different points of view for whatever the reason. Why do you have to do this? Why aren't there people coming up through the ranks? And I'm assuming this is something that you at the Globe are doing.
Bringing people up through the ranks?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, in newsrooms especially, you know, in all of corporate America it's important, but you know, in newsrooms it's really, representation really matters. As you both know, having been in newsrooms, that you really need a variety of voices and a variety of perspectives on the stories. And I think that thanks to a lot of trailblazers like you, that the newsrooms are places where there actually tends to be a lot more women. You know, at the Globe newsroom, we're almost equal in terms of management. I think it's 48 versus 52% for female versus male managers. And really having that sets a culture within the organization that also brings in more. So I think that there are some deeper benches, but there's also, you know, not all newsrooms have been places where diverse voices have been valued.
No. And what about class distinctions? Because for a long time it was who got to go to journalism school. Mm-hmm. Now, luckily, there's different avenues now to get into the business. But we have a question from someone in the audience who, you know, is the progress of women in media affected in any way by class disparity in the newsroom? Linda, you have thoughts on that?
I think that right now there's so many really exciting jobs of people of all different types of approaches to journalism. You know, the new people who are coming in with incredible video storytelling that aren't necessarily journalism backgrounds. So I think that there's a lot of people who've been there for a long time, who've cut their teeth on, you know, they went to journalism school and followed the traditional path, but some of our editors never went to journalism school. It's something that you learn by doing.
No, I think that's right. I mean, so I approach this from two angles. One is Epicenter. So I left CNN last year. I launched a newsletter from Queens because we were one of the hardest hit communities in the world by the pandemic. And an email newsletter is kind of a privileged product in and of itself. You assume the people you're serving have an email address. When we started getting involved in vaccine rollout efforts, it became clear to us that, especially like one community we worked with very closely were restaurant workers. We communicated with them mostly by phone, text, and WhatsApp. And I think that newsrooms are reticent to change the formats that we work in. So some of it is definitely class in terms of who we're hiring, but it's actually re-examination of the product itself and how we do business in order to reach more communities. And for us, that was pretty transformative because when it became clear that, you know, these are restaurant workers who work 2 or 3 jobs, they might have internet connection on their smartphone, but they don't have the time, right? The luxury of a 700-word story, the luxury of a Twitter feed, which some of you might be like, that's not a luxury, I hate my Twitter feed, but that all requires time. And so we've had to really rethink what are the formats that we're serving these populations with.
Well, were you going to say something?
No.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering too about the function of newspapers right now. I want to talk about just a little in this time. It's so interesting to hear that, you know, Kay Graham was dealing with the big lie of the day. Mm-hmm. Took this gutsy move. You know, Ben Bradley said, you know, she's ballsy. I know it's early on, pretty much, but have you ever had to, you have, you know, editors, much as she did, but have you ever had to step in and greenlight something that might have been a risky place for the paper to go? Have you had to do that yet?
Yeah, I think that really what I admire most about Katharine Graham is that when the chips were down, she stuck to the value of the importance of journalism. And we've had some smaller, we haven't had anything to the level of the Pentagon Papers, but Stat News was the first to sue Purdue Pharma with the whole OxyContin thing. And that was a big risk. They had we knew that it was going to result in lawsuits. And Rick Burke is the editor of Stat News, our life sciences publication, and we pushed forward. We said, this is something that we're willing to take this risk on. And that opened up, and because of that, we were the first to have. It took us years. Other organizations end up joining in, but it's not to the level. But just sort of having that commitment to, this is the right thing to do in this situation. This is what's in the best interest of journalism, even though we're going to get a penalty somewhere down the line. That sort of commitment, which Katharine Graham modeled so well.
Yeah. And of course, the Boston Globe also did the Spotlight series on the Catholic Church, which this was before your.
It was before my time, but yes, that
lots of lawyers looking at that one as well. What do you think? Again, with Kay Graham looking down, maybe really, but really here on us. A lot of media outlets are having internal debates, doing some soul searching about the last 4 years. Were we too late in calling a lie? Too late in saying that somebody was lying? And early on, even in 2016, too much moral equivalency. Well, if you say something, you're nodding, Mitra, so you take this.
So yes. And if you can tell, I left CNN for a reason. I left on very good terms. I'm still very close to folks there. I admire what they do every day. I think one of the challenges is, since the days of Kay Graham and her decision making, that really did change, I think, the direction of democracy is how you put it. We now in newsrooms are forced to make decisions like that multiple times a day. I don't want to equate it to the Pentagon Papers, but I do think that the amount of information that we put out now, compared to what we're celebrating tonight, it's just like night and day. And so the ethical decision making, it is intense, it's enormous, and that's not to give anybody a pass. But there were many days. I think about them so vividly through the Trump administration, where we would need to get the news out because, and Linda and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, but it is a rush on the internet to not even just to be first, but to participate, right? And your entire fortunes rest on, did I make this month? Are people turning to my website? I don't want to discount this as like clickbait, which I think we often do as, oh, these are cat videos. Your relevance as a news organization is resting on your ability to respond to news. And so I don't want to give us a pass, but much of that time was just like, how do we get this out? We got to get this out. Tomorrow, we should have a deeper discussion on fact checking, on misinformation, on, can we say this is racism explicitly, or should we say this is racially tinged, which I'm sure we all have feelings about that phrasing. I'd love to see an example of something that's racially tinged as opposed to racist. But
or why a lie instead of a falsehood?
Or a lie instead of a falsehood. And so we would just, and again, I was a part of that decision making. And so when you say, is there a decision you've been a part? I think about thousands of decisions I made that people will never know, because some of it was what we didn't go with, right? So we often talk about, we published. There's a lot of stuff we didn't publish, right? And that's a part of the decision making. So I completely think that we are, in my case, not just learning from those mistakes, but said, you know what? Instead of trying to effect change within a legacy organization, let me just try to start over. Let me start over with how we deal with the police. Let me start over with how we cover government. And that's just been an easier path for me, who's trying to center Blackness in both companies, even though I am not Black, but it is possible to do that. that is the tact I've taken in order to reconcile the rest of my career and how I'm going to respond to this moment in history.
You know, it's been happening for years. I mean, 2003, how many media outlets didn't cover 500,000 people marching on Washington in protest of an invasion of Iraq, because it seemed kind of unpatriotic at the time, because we were just a couple years after 9/11, and there was a lot of soul searching after that. In 2016, the moral equivalency of the coverage of the campaign. If you say something bad about Trump, well, you have to say something bad about Hillary Clinton.
That's right. And the two-sidedness, which is kind of like the economics of how journalism was created, right? Like it's one side, the other side. And then you're like, oh my God, there's actually 50 sides to a story. It's, you know, the reason it's making news is because it's complicated.
Or just one in some cases.
In some.
One. And Linda, I want to ask you about that, because again, I find myself thinking at a lot of these moments, what would Kay Graham have done? I really have thought that, you know, what would she have done? But she's not contending with the fact that people are choosing other media. And when I think of her, I'm also remembering that after the Washington Post exposed Watergate, which led to Nixon resigning rather than being impeached, Roger Ailes, William Kristol, conservatives walked from those ashes and said, we are never again, I mean, this is pretty well documented, we are never again going to let a media outlet, one paper, the Washington Post, take down our president. We are going to form our own media, our own think tanks. We're going to make a cycle that we only need to feed in our own pond. Now, Bill Kristol now is, you know, one of the fiercest voices against Donald Trump. And when we had him on, I said to him, but didn't you create this monster, if you would call it that, and you are calling it that, and then lose control of it by making this separate parallel media, which he lost control of. He's no longer welcome at the Fox News that he helped create. What do you do about that, Linda, that you're not reaching people who are just have so many other news sources? And some of it is, I mean, we've reached a time where we have part of the populace that, you know, doesn't believe in science, doesn't believe in our electoral process. You know, what do you do? What are you doing about that? What are you thinking about that?
Well, there are a couple different approaches. One is that it's up to the job for the news organization to really have a variety of voices that reaches different audiences. And then, you know, one of the things that we talk about at the Boston Globe is that people know what the Boston Globe is, but they don't know why it matters to them. And so it's our job, it's not their job, it's our job to continually tell that story and to welcome in and to meet people where they are. We can't just say, well, look, we print a paper. You know, we have to meet people, which is what your company is very good at, is meeting people and finding where they are and giving them the information that they need. And that's adapting to different formats, which I think we're very good at in terms of, that's for sort of a diversity of audiences. In terms of ideological audiences, it's hard. People are going to find the things that appeal to them. And again, it's up to us to have a variety of viewpoints, and I think that we try to reflect different viewpoints, but some people are just not going to subscribe to a paper. Some people are not going to subscribe to newsletters. Thankfully, there are a lot of different opportunities for people.
Yeah, it's something we think about all the time, how to not just, we have a tent, we have a great tent, but how to bring people in the tent, being, listening to their point of view, but also, pointing out when it's just not based in fact. By the way,
one of the great examples I think of that it's sort of an easy one for people to understand, I think, is that when it used to be that when you were talking about climate change, that they would always have to have a source of somebody who disagreed with climate change. Right. And I think that there's been, in the past few years, especially in the past year and a half, this sort of feeling that you don't have to represent both sides on every single issue. I think that there are some issues, such as issues of human rights, issues of equality, that news organizations, I should say, have moved beyond that presenting both sides-ism.
That it is such a great point, and for the students here, there's actually a name for it. There's a theory for it that a journalism professor came up with. There are concentric circles. On the Media did a great hour on this. You guys should Google it. There are these concentric circles, and things move from both sides out of the both sides. Climate change did. Oh my gosh, within the last 20 years, because I can remember there was sort of a, well, do we need another voice on whether or not there's climate change? Thank goodness we don't. We don't. But you still have to reach the people who are listening to that other voice through another media to hear things that are not true about climate change. I just want to say, somebody in the audience wanted to know, how did Bill Kristol respond to the proposition that he, he started this thing that he is protesting, and he didn't like it. He didn't like the question. He said, well, that's a bit harsh. But sometimes questions have to be asked, it's okay, as we know. I want to thank both of our terrific guests. The hour just flew. I wish we had more time, but Mitra Kalita, URL Media, founder, CEO, Linda Henry from our own Boston Globe. Thank you both so much. And let's thank that woman up there.
Thank you.
Thank all of you for coming. I hope you can come back to City Space. I hope we can keep doing this with a limited audience, because it means so much for us to connect with you. And please continue connecting with WBUR. We'd love, Margaret Lowe wants to hear comments. We just really, really appreciate you. So thank you to you as well. Thank you. And we wish you all a safe night. I think our students are going to come up, so we're going to put our masks on.
Oh, great.
Right? Shouldn't we?